Dan?
Yes.
Dan?
Yes.
Oh,
Jay.
you are still alive.
I am. It's been crazy, but I've made it.
I'm still alive.
I know. We
You might
both had
notice
close.
you might notice a little wonkiness in my
Yeah.
hat. I will apologize. We went to Lake Tahoe,
Mm-hmm.
and as you do when you're in Lake Tahoe, you wear a hat to protect yourself from the sun. It's
Right.
sunny and hot. We went to the beach and went jet skis. So I took off my hat
Uh-huh.
and I put it in what I thought was waterproof storage in the front of the jet ski.
Uh-oh. And it's not waterproof.
Not waterproof.
No.
When I put the hat back on, it was incredibly wet, incredibly cold because Lake Tahoe is a glacier-fed lake.
Oh, it's so
And it was
nice
so
on a
refreshing to
summer
put
day.
the hat on. I'm like, oh, that feels so good. And then the whole hat just started to melt down on my head. And I'm like, no, it's not a bucket hat.
Yep. You got to
How
use
have you been?
steam to reshape that thing.
Yes, I need to steam it and reshape it and get it back to where it should be. But
I've been living in this hat and in my straw hat, which you can see is completely dirty and crushed because
that has definitely been your work hat.
Yeah, it's been my work hat. I'm up here finally building my house, building my place on 20 acres in the mountains, out in the hot sun every day, running a sawmill, bucking logs, just build my blacksmith shop today. It's been quite the adventure.
So your nearest neighbor is what, 20 miles and 5 feet away?
Quarter mile away. I got quarter mile one way, quarter mile the other way, and about half mile that way.
Sounds about right. That sounds like remote Washington.
Yep. It's great stuff.
Nice. Who should we talk about today?
Oh, you've been going on and on about Tad Williams, who has, despite my limited experience with him, a special place in my heart. So he seems like a good one. By the way, we should introduce ourselves.
Oh, wait, it's been so ding dang long.
We are writers and readers with a hat problem. My name is J. Daniel Sawyer. You can find my stuff at jdsawyer.net.
Not jdanielsawyer.net, jdsawyer.net.
jdsawyer.net, yes.
I am J.R. Murdoch, author, writer, hat wearer. You can find me at jrmurdoch.com. That's J.R. Yep. First name is J, so yeah. At any rate, Tad Williams.
Tail Chaser's song, Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn, the Other Land series.
Let's start with Tail Chaser.
Okay.
Because I don't know how I found Tail Chaser, but I want to say it was shortly after Tad Williams came out with the last to Green Angel Tower, the Austin
Memory, Sorrow,
and
Thorn, yeah.
Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn. And I found Tail Chaser before I started reading Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn. And I'm like, it's a cat book. Why am I reading a book about a cat? No, I'm going to tell you right here and now. I've read books about cats and I'm like, oh, you have got to be freaking kidding me. They're just never struck me as anything I would want to read. So somebody, I think it was somebody told me, handed me the book, said you have to read this. I want to say it was a friend of mine that gave me the book, said you have to read this. I'm like, it's a cat book. I'm a dog person, not really a cat person. They're like, no. Yeah, trust me. It isn't just a book about a cat. It goes into cat mythos and cat gods and cat demons and alternate. And I'm like, what am I reading right now? It just blew my mind that, and it's not a long read. I mean, when you pick up Tad Williams, you're like, oh, that's a Tad Williams book. And we're not talking big font either.
No.
We're talking teeny tiny text. We're talking, how did they fit all that in one book?
The kind of stuff I write when I get too out of hand.
Yeah, this is what I expect Antithesis to be like, is a doorstop like that.
Yep. 6 of them, in fact, yes.
Yes. So when I actually got into Austin Arndt, Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn, those types of books, incredible, lush tapestries he weaves. I remember at the time I read the first book, and I was doing crossword puzzles a lot when I wasn't reading. So when I had time at work, it's like lunchtime, I would do crossword puzzles. Mm-hmm. And this is one of those things that just stick with you. I don't know why, but one of the words in the crossword puzzle was limb, Limn. And I'm like, what's that word mean? Outlined with light. And I'm like, oh, hey, that's fascinating. I'm reading the first Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn book.
Mm-hmm.
He uses that word twice in that book. And I'm like, I know what that word means. I don't have to pull out the
Excellent.
freaking dictionary.
Mm-hmm.
It felt like a victory. Um,
Fantastic.
but absolutely fascinating. He was talking about a gem that was limned in light. And I'm like, oh, you can just visualize this kind of stuff. One random thing I remember about the first book, and I thought it was going to have bigger connotations. At the very beginning of the first book, there's a vine that wraps around a tree, and
Mm-hmm.
the thorns end up strangulating and killing this tree. And I'm like, wow, that's so vivid. And the main character later on in the book, one of those thorns sticks in his arm or in his hand and sinks in, and he loses it. And I'm like, where's he going to go with that?
Mm.
Nowhere, nowhere.
Nowhere? Oh man.
Nothing else happens with that. And I'm like, that's one of those little details that stuck with me. And I'm like, where's he going with this? But overall, freaking amazing books. Um, I remember it took me weeks to get through them because it was one of those, had a fresh child, limited time. So I would sit down and I'm reading 10-15 minutes a day at best. And it took me weeks to get through the books. And I'm like, wow, just incredible. I had them in paperback, which, you pick up
Yeah,
a
same.
hardcover this size
They're
and you
so they're so big in paperback that the last volume is split into
did
two.
two
They're
into
they're
two
two that are this
books.
thick.
Yes. And
Please
they are
forgive my dirty
dense.
hands. I've been working
And
in the dirt.
and they are really hard to hold when you're reading,
Mm-hmm.
because it just the density of the book.
Yep.
But absolutely incredible reading. um how did you first discover Tad?
Well, my spousal type person is a huge fan, and so she came into the relationship with Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn and Tail Chaser's song, and this was back in like '97, so that was about all he'd done. And so,
Dan, I think I
this
lost you.
called Caliban's. Can
I
you
lost
see
you
me
for a
now?
second there.
Okay, so she came into the relationship with Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn and Tail Chaser's song. And a couple of years later, I was at a remainder sale and I found these teeny little book, this matched set of two with different covers, but it was the same book, called Caliban's Hour. And I just loved the artwork so much, I picked up both of them because have the set, and gave it as a present. I hadn't picked up any of his stuff to read because by that time I was already kind of not into fantasy anymore. I try every once in a while. It's still, nothing really grabs me. But at some point, the cover for Caliban's Hour just got to me, so I picked it up and I read it through. And it's about a 75-page book. Reads real fast, and it was one of the most beautiful things I had ever read. Still to this day, it is one of the most perfect books I've ever read. I've not cracked another one of Tad Williams' books open because this book was so perfect. I'm
Oh,
convinced he can't top it. But I was so blown away by it that I sent him an email thanking him for it because it just hit me at exactly the right point in life, in addition to being remarkably well done. And he and I started talking. It was evidently one he wrote for wrote for the woman who became his wife at over a bet or something. She was either his editor or his agent at the time, and it the book became sort of part of their courtship. And we emailed back and forth for a couple of weeks, and then the conversation petered out, and that was that. Fast forward 10 years, I bump into him at World Fantasy Con in San Jose. And so yeah, I introduced myself. By this time, I'm an author, and the podcast is doing really well. I've got 20,000 listeners a month, so some people around there have heard of me. And so I introduced him and thanked him again for Caliban's Hour. He's like, "Oh my God." And he's like all excited to see me. And he calls his wife over and they start talking about this email exchange we had. And then they start talking about other stuff that I was involved in that I wasn't involved in. And we get going back and forth. And it turns out that the guy that introduced them had the same name and looks a lot like me. And so he had conflated, except that guy's British, and they'd conflated these two people in their heads. Took us about 45 minutes of going back and forth to work that out. It was hilarious.
Honey, it's Dan.
Yeah, it's exactly what he did. And I'm like, were the emails that special? And they remembered the emails, but they had conflated the two people in their heads.
Oh, that is
And
too funny.
it was an incredibly sweet man, very, very sharp, great conversationalist.
Oh yeah. I definitely recommend anybody who's viewing this, anyone who's listening, check out him on Facebook. Go like his page. He goes live on Facebook once a week, once every other week, and just fascinating to listen to him talk. And I will say, when you get into his voice in his books, I will say you have different expectations.
Yeah, you expect someone who sounds kind of like Martin Shaw or Ian McKellen, someone who's
Yes,
very deep
you expect
voice
him to
and
be
very
sitting back with a
buttery
pipe and
English
stroking
accent.
his beard as he's telling you these grand. No, Tad
No.
is a very down to earth kind of guy, but
Yep.
his voice,
yes, he's got
from
what,
what
a
you would
New
expect.
Mexico or Chicago accent, and it's a little bit higher pitched than mine, but very similar kind of speaking style.
It's higher pitched than most tenor singers I know. It threw me off when I first heard it. I'm like, wow, that's a really high pitched voice. But again, he's very well spoken when he talks. Love listening to him. I can just turn him on and just listen to him and be like, wow, this is just fascinating. Little stories he'll roll on about. And he'll just talk about where he's at with his writing, or I'm on this book and whatnot. And it's just fun to listen to him talk. But back to his works, I will tell you, if you haven't read Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn yet,
I haven't. I own it, but I haven't read it.
In my opinion, it is not your typical fantasy, which sounds cliche. Everyone's like, oh, this isn't your standard fantasy fare. Well, Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn isn't yes, there are grand battles, but that's not what the books are about. That is window dressing. That happens. Yes, you've got your generals that you're talking about, but it's very much about the interactions of what the individual people are doing on both sides.
Yeah, I heard someone once described it to me as it's what Game of Thrones wants to be when it grows up.
Very much so, because there are so many interactions and so many characters that is just absolutely fascinating. I love going through some of the interactions with the elvish type characters, and I don't recall, I don't believe he called them elves. They were a different type of character, but you catch on that they're elves. And it's just a fun ride all the way through. I mean, where the main character is starving and he stumbles across an onion and he's like, oh my gosh, food, and he just gobbles down this onion, skin and all. And you're like, just little things like that throughout the books just stick with you.
Nice.
Because the characters become so real to you. And I think that's what's so much fun about his writing. And that's why I decided to continue on with Austin Ard is, he just dropped this one. This one just showed up on my doorstep while I was up in Lake Tahoe. And I'm like, oh, I saw it on the doorbell and I'm like, please don't let a porch thief come by. So this one just came out. I'm very excited to dig in. I want to dig into this entire series. I haven't touched the series yet because I'm one of those that's like, okay, how many books are going to be in this series? Let me have the whole series first. I'll burn through it.
Yeah, Caliban's Hour I read in 2003 or 2004 once, and I remember it almost well enough to be able to quote from it. It was that sharply written, and the thematic material, the intertwining of love and loss, and the relationship, especially between language and consciousness and sin, is a really strong thread that weaves through the whole book. And it's a retelling of the Tempest through the eyes of Caliban instead of Prospero and the other human characters. And it's just stunning.
It's like he wrote a book just for you.
It really is.
I'll definitely. I haven't picked those ones up. I picked up all his girthy stuff, the Otherland series, a quadrilogy of books.
Yep, all this. I've got that one too, but I haven't cracked it yet.
Oh, burn through that one. Oh my gosh. virtual reality before virtual reality was a thing. That's
Mhm.
that's all I can say about it. You know, the metaverse has nothing on Otherland.
Well,
I've
let's be
seen
fair. The metaverse has nothing. Period. But
pretty much. It's when you go through Otherland and you start discovering these worlds that people have created, universes that people have created,
Mhm.
every one of them so rich, detailed, and different from the next. It's like the
Mm.
characters are going through video games and they're stuck in the video game because they're in the virtual reality.
Mhm.
Rather than just strapping on a pair of goggles, they're in tanks. So everything that happens, the fluid in the tank will change to make them feel like they're in that environment. When they're walking, they're actually
Nice.
moving their body. Things like that. It's crazy type of stuff. It's Matrix type of stuff before the Matrix was the thing.
Yep.
Even that's when all these books came out, and I'm really convinced a lot of these ideas came from that. You know, how would you do that? Well, you'd have to have them in a fluid. Oh,
Mhm.
what's in the Matrix? Um, Absolutely fascinating books. I can't recommend those ones enough. Even the Shadow, I think it's I want to say Shadow Keep, but I know that's wrong. Shadow Play was one of them. But I don't know why, but it took me two books to figure out. Oh wait, these little characters that are flitting around are fairies. He
Nice.
gave them different names, like I forget what they're called. Like Brandon Sanderson calls them spree or something like that, and they're fairies. And he gives them his own little spin on them, their own characters. But it wasn't until one of the characters was flying into a dungeon. I'm like, wait, the character's literally flying. And then my everything started to click and make sense. I'm like, oh, I've been reading this too slowly. It's not digesting properly. I find I need to read faster for things to really digest well.
Mhm.
But again, yeah, that's these are coming back to Austin Ard. So I kind of feel like I need to read Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn again, but
Mhm.
I don't think I can read all of that and then all of these in that time frame in a
Now
shorter
get the
time frame.
audiobooks. Burn through the audiobooks on your commute and then read those when you get done.
I have no commute. I work from home.
Oh, well, there you go.
If I did, I could probably burn through one book in 2 months. I'm sure they're 30 plus hour audiobooks, much like Game of Thrones was.
Good point. Good point. Yep.
But no, I'm gonna enjoy digesting these ones.
Nice.
Anyway, Dan,
Jay
so
and
nice.
Tad, if you're watching, thank you for that wonderful conversation and for Caliban's Hour. And I will one day come back and read the rest of your
Yes,
books.
and Tad, if you're watching, just thank you for being a prolific author of incredibly dense tomes that I could take these into battle and I could do some damage.
Ah.
Dan,
All right. Jay, I guess
all right.
we already gave our info, so I guess we'll see everybody next time.
Until next time.
All right.
Bye now.
Bye.